I was not uninvited from the wedding with a text. I was exiled by the voices of two children who had called me their aunt for 8 years. The absolute cruelest part was they did not invent those words themselves. You are out of the wedding. It is only for real family. By the end of that night, nobody argued about who was real family anymore. Every document, stolen dollar, and lie rested plainly on the table. My name is Violet Green, at 37 years old. As the Director of Operations for Alder Quill Systems, I made a living out of predicting disasters, mitigating risks, and keeping chaotic variables under strict control. But nothing in my corporate playbook could have prepared me for the sterile, surgical precision of the betrayal that arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. The air in Madame Helene's bridal boutique smelled faintly of lavender, steamed silk, and expensive suburban anxiety. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long, lazy shadows across the manicured parking lot of the upscale strip mall. Inside, I was standing on a velvet-covered pedestal, surrounded by 3 massive mirrors that reflected a woman encased in layers of blush-colored chiffon. The seamstress, a quiet woman with measuring tape draped like a rosary around her neck, was carefully pinning the hem of my bridesmaid dress. My phone, resting on a nearby velvet-tufted stool, vibrated aggressively. The screen flashed with a video call request. Brooke, my older sister. I carefully reached for the phone, mindful of the pins near my ankles. I accepted the call, expecting a frantic question about floral centerpieces or napkin ring colors. Instead, the screen filled with the chaotic background of the reception hall's staging room, a blur of white roses and gold-painted chairs. Brooke's face came into view, her makeup flawless, her smile strained into a rigid, practiced curve. She was not alone. Flanking her were my niece and nephew, 12-year-old Maddie and 9-year-old Evan. They looked uncomfortable, their eyes darting off-screen before returning to the camera lens. "Hey, Brooke," I said, keeping my voice light. "I am right in the middle of the final hem. The blush chiffon is actually falling perfectly." "Violet, hold on," Brooke interrupted. Her voice had that specific, sugary pitch she reserved for public performances and school parent meetings. "The kids have something they need to tell you." A cold prickle of apprehension started at the base of my neck. Brooke shifted the phone slightly, centering Maddie and Evan in the frame. Brooke nudged Maddie's shoulder. "Go ahead, honey. Tell Aunt Vi what Mommy told you to say." Maddie looked down, her young face pale. When she looked back up at the camera, her eyes were completely blank, devoid of the warmth that usually accompanied my name. She recited the words mechanically, like a hostage reading a ransom demand from a teleprompter. "You are out of the wedding. It is only for real family." The boutique around me seemed to instantly lose all its oxygen. The ambient noise of classical music and low chatter vanished. Before my brain could even process the syllables Maddie had just dropped into the room. Evan leaned closer to the phone. His 9-year-old face was earnest, completely unaware of the devastation he was delivering. "Mom said you will understand because you are not really one of us at the ceremony." I stood frozen on the pedestal. The blood roared in my ears. The blow was not simply being stripped of a title or being banned from a party. If Brooke had screamed at me, if she had sent a vicious email, I could have handled it, but this was calculated. She had weaponized the 2 people I loved most in the world, forcing them to be the executioners of our relationship. She was using my niece and nephew to sanitize her cruelty, framing my exclusion as a family consensus rather than her own unilateral malice. The silence that followed stretched out, heavy and suffocating. I realized then that I had not muted my phone. The volume was turned all the way up. The seamstress at my feet had stopped moving completely. Her hands hovered over the fabric, a silver pin glinting in the harsh fitting room light. I glanced at the mirror and saw the reflections of 2 other customers in the adjacent fitting areas. They were staring at me, their faces caught in expressions of secondhand horror and pity. I looked back at the screen. Brooke was watching me, drinking in my stunned silence. Her eyes betrayed a sickening glimmer of satisfaction. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew the shop was open. She knew I was surrounded by strangers. The public humiliation was not an accident. It was the main course. Brooke let the silence hang for a few agonizing seconds before delivering the final, poisonous strike. "It is just a boundary we have to set for the emotional health of the household," Brooke said, her tone dripping with fake therapy buzzwords. "But do not worry, you can still help with the final catering and floral payments this week. You know, if you truly love the kids and want their mother to have a beautiful day." There it was. The audacity of it was almost breathtaking. I was no longer a sister, no longer an aunt, no longer a bridesmaid. I was a discarded wallet, expected to fund a celebration I was just publicly banished from by the children I was supposed to be doing it for. Anger, white-hot and blinding, flared in my chest, but I did not let it reach my face. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not demand explanations or hurl insults. In my line of work, when a system fails catastrophically, you do not panic. You isolate the breach, you secure the remaining assets, and you shut the system down. I looked directly into the camera, staring past the bewildered faces of Maddie and Evan, locking eyes with my sister. My voice was entirely steady, devoid of the emotion she so desperately wanted to extract from me. "Thank you," I said, the words crisp and clear in the quiet boutique. "You just helped me see everything clearly." I tapped the red button. The screen went dark. I carefully handed the phone back to the velvet stool. I looked down at the seamstress, who was still kneeling, unsure if she should breathe. "Take the pins out," I told her quietly. "I will not be needing the dress." The drive back to my townhouse was entirely silent. I did not turn on the radio to drown out my thoughts. I did not pull over to cry. My mind, trained by years of dissecting corporate crises and mitigating operational disasters, had completely taken over. By the time I walked through my front door and locked the deadbolt behind me, the emotional bleeding had stopped, replaced by a chilling, absolute clarity. I walked straight past the kitchen, ignoring the untouched cup of morning coffee on the counter, and went directly into my home office. I opened my laptop. For the past 4 months, I had been the silent financial engine behind my sister's extravagant dream wedding. I was the reliable safety net, the one who stepped in when her budget inexplicably fell short. It was time to audit the engine. If I were a different kind of person, I might have immediately called the caterers, the florists, and the venue, screaming into the receiver to cancel everything and burn it all down. But blind retaliation is messy, and it leaves you legally vulnerable. Instead, I opened a blank, encrypted spreadsheet. I needed a forensic accounting of exactly where my money was, and more importantly, where my legal liabilities lay. I created 4 distinct columns across the screen: gifted, advanced, sole signatory, and co-signed, as I meticulously combed through digital folders, cross-referencing bank statements with vendor contracts. The sheer volume of the expenditures painted a sickening picture. I began dropping numbers into the columns: $3,000 for the custom invitations, $7,000 advanced for the photographer. But as I dug deeper into the contracts, a terrifying discrepancy caught my eye. I opened the master agreements for the imported floral installations and the vintage car rentals. Both were tied to my primary email address, which made sense as I was the financial guarantor. However, when I checked the digital footprint and the security certificates of the electronic signatures attached to the bottom of the PDFs, a cold knot formed in my stomach. The timestamps on the signatures were from 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday. I had been asleep. I pulled up the IP address logged by the signature software. It did not match my home network or my office server. It traced back directly to a residential broadband provider in Brooke's upscale neighborhood. She had not just been using the supplementary platinum credit card I gave her to conveniently purchase minor wedding accessories. She had actively logged into an old shared family portal, perhaps remembering a password I had used years ago, and legally bound me to tens of thousands of dollars in new vendor contracts while I was asleep in my bed. It was not just entitlement, it was borderline identity theft. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I logged into my primary banking portal. With 3 precise clicks, the secondary platinum card carrying Brooke's name was permanently locked and reported for suspicious activity. I systematically cycled through every financial platform, retirement account, and vendor payment portal I possessed. I changed every password to complex, randomly generated alphanumeric sequences. I activated high-alert fraud notifications across all my profiles, setting the system to require a physical 2-factor authentication from my personal device for any transaction over $1. The financial pipeline was now completely, irrevocably shut off. I opened a new email draft addressed to Brooke. I did not type out a greeting. I did not demand an apology or ask her why she had used the children to do her dirty work. I kept it to a single, airtight declaration. Effective at 6 o'clock this evening, all wedding funding from my accounts is permanently terminated. A list of outstanding vendor invoices that you must now handle yourself is attached. I attached the spreadsheet, converted to a read-only PDF, and hit send. No threats, no emotional outbursts, just a closed valve. Less than 20 minutes later, my phone vibrated intensely against the mahogany surface of my desk. It was the family group chat. Brooke must have tried to run a charge on the frozen card and panicked when it declined, immediately calling our mother to run interference. Diane Green was always the first to deploy emotional damage control on Brooke's behalf. "Brooke is practically in tears," my mother texted the group. "She says you are pulling out of helping with the vendors. Your sister is just under a massive amount of stress right now and being overly sensitive about the guest list. Please, Violet, do not make a massive scene right before the big day. You need to be the bigger person and keep the peace for the family." I stared at the glowing screen. Overly sensitive. She was talking about Brooke, framing my sister as the fragile, overwhelmed victim of pre-wedding jitters. She was completely erasing the deliberate, calculated cruelty of using a 12-year-old girl and a 9-year-old boy as executioners. My mother was demanding I absorb the abuse to maintain the illusion of a perfect family portrait. Before I could even process the audacity of my mother's text, a notification popped up at the top of my screen. Instagram. Brooke had just posted a new story to her public profile. I tapped the alert. It was a text-based image featuring a muted, aesthetic pastel background. The caption read, "Sometimes, the absolute hardest part of protecting your children is setting firm boundaries with toxic people you thought you could trust. Putting my kids' emotional safety first. Always. Thankful for my real tribe." She was already spinning the narrative. To anyone on the outside. To our extended relatives and mutual friends. I was now the unstable, toxic aunt who had somehow threatened her children, forcing a brave, protective mother to agonizingly cut ties. Brooke was playing the ultimate victim card, weaponizing modern therapy jargon to disguise a blatant, premeditated character assassination. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, the cool glow of the monitor illuminating the dark walls of my office. The pieces of the puzzle were shifting rapidly, forming a completely different, much darker picture. This was never just about bridesmaid dresses, seating charts, or wedding aesthetics, the public humiliation at the boutique, the unauthorized electronic signatures binding me to massive debts, the immediate pivot to painting me as a psychological danger to my own niece and nephew on social media. It was far too coordinated. Brooke was not just throwing a bridal tantrum to get her way. She was actively building a paper trail and a public consensus to ostracize me. You do not run a smear campaign of this magnitude just to save face over a party. You do it to discredit a threat. You do it to push someone completely out of the way before a much larger transaction takes place. I closed the group chat without typing a single word in reply. I did not need to win an argument with my mother, and I did not need to defend myself against a fabricated Instagram post. I needed to find out exactly what my sister was preparing to steal. The spreadsheet on my monitor blurred slightly as I scrolled past the endless rows of catering deposits and venue retainers. I had reached the finalized guest list data, specifically the contribution links that had been distributed to our extended relatives. A massive line item near the bottom anchored my attention. It was elegantly labeled, "The Family Legacy Table Sponsorship." The total amount collected was staggering, hovering near $35,000. This money had been gathered from our wealthy aunts, aging uncles, and my parents' affluent country club associates. The description beneath the funding goal explicitly noted it was a dedicated college fund drive for Maddie and Evan, heavily promoted on the formal invitations as a meaningful alternative to traditional wedding gifts. The sheer irony tasted like dry ash in my mouth. That exact concept had been my original suggestion over 6 months ago. I had proposed skipping the useless crystal gravy boats and instead establishing an educational trust for the kids to secure their futures. Brooke had loudly praised the idea during our Thanksgiving dinner, boasting to the entire dining room about the new 529 educational savings plans she had supposedly just opened for them. Except, as I scrutinized the routing number listed on the digital payment gateway, the facade crumbled. The banking code did not belong to a state-sponsored educational trust or any recognized tax-advantaged college fund. I cross-referenced the routing digits through a public financial directory. It was a standard commercial checking account registered to an entity called Greenhearth Events Limited Liability Company. I opened a new, secure browser tab and navigated directly to the North Bryan County Public Business Registry. My fingers tapped a rapid, anxious rhythm against the mahogany desk as the outdated government portal slowly loaded. I typed the company name into the search bar. The results populated instantly. Greenhearth Events had been incorporated exactly 3 weeks ago. The registered agent and primary manager was Brooke. I clicked on the master filing document to view the listed corporate officers. I fully expected to see the name of her fiancé, Grant Holloway. They were about to blend their lives, so establishing a joint corporate entity for their finances made logical sense. But Grant was completely absent from the paperwork. The authorized co-signer, the only other person with full executive control over the incoming funds, was Martin Green, my father. A cold, heavy dread settled deep into my stomach. My father was a retired commercial real estate developer who worshipped the concept of patriarchal legacy above all else. He and Brooke had always shared a highly transactional language, viewing familial affection as a commodity to be traded for loyalty and returns. If he was quietly co-signing a shadow company with my sister right before her wedding, he was not just passively supporting her big day, he was actively shielding her newly acquired assets. My personal cell phone lit up on the desk, the sudden bright screen startling me in the dim office. It was a secure encrypted text message from Marcus, a former colleague from my corporate banking days who currently managed compliance at a major regional branch downtown. We had not spoken in over 4 months. His message was brief, professional, and entirely alarming. He wrote that my name was currently appearing in a compliance review tied to a very large internal wire transfer. He asked whether I had authorized the transfer or was closing out any shared accounts. I stared at the glowing text. I was not migrating any assets. I had just locked down my entire financial ecosystem. But Brooke and my father were clearly trying to move a massive sum of money, and somehow, my name was the anchor they were utilizing to bypass the bank's strict anti-money laundering protocols. They were weaponizing the wholesome facade of the wedding, the emotional leverage of the children, and the impenetrable shield of family tradition to pool cash from every conceivable direction and funnel it into a completely unregulated private fund. My mind raced back through the digital trail. If they were using my name to authorize a massive transfer, they needed my signature, not just the forged electronic one on the late-night floral contracts, but something substantial, something I had unknowingly provided myself. I pulled up my archived email folders and rigorously searched for the word sponsor. A message from Brooke, dated exactly 3 weeks ago, the exact same day the shadow company was incorporated, materialized in the inbox. The subject line framed it as a simple vendor authorization form for the master catering deposit. I vividly remembered quickly reviewing the first page, seeing the familiar catering company logo, and digitally signing the bottom while I was rushing between morning board meetings. I opened the attached file again, zooming in on the document properties. It was not a single contract. It was a master document containing multiple nested files. I scrolled past the catering agreement to the second page. It was a sponsor addendum. I scrolled down to the third page. The breath caught sharply in my throat. The document had absolutely nothing to do with catering, floral arrangements, or a wedding venue. It was a temporary power of attorney declaration, formatted specifically for the North Bryan County Probate Court. The dense legal text explicitly authorized the temporary transfer of all administrative rights regarding the estate of our late maternal grandmother over to Brooke. Our grandmother had passed away late last year, leaving behind a highly lucrative lakefront property and a substantial investment portfolio explicitly meant to be divided equally among her grandchildren. The estate was currently still tied up in probate. By slipping this hidden authorization into a routine stack of wedding vendor contracts, Brooke had successfully tricked me into signing away my legal right to contest the management of that inheritance. The twisted narrative she was violently spinning suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense, calling me a toxic danger to her children, having my niece and nephew publicly declare I was not real family. If I was effectively estranged and declared a hostile outsider by the entire family unit, there would be no one to question why I was quietly, systematically cut out of the generational wealth transfer. The wedding was merely an extravagant, highly publicized smokescreen. The real heist was the family legacy. The text message arrived on Thursday at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It read that Mom made a roast, that I should come over at 7 o'clock tonight, and that we needed to clear the air before the big day because family is family. It was a textbook maneuver by my sister. She was framing a trap as an olive branch, hosting it on our parents' turf to ensure she had a favorable jury, and daring me to decline so I would look like the bitter, unreasonable party. I did not decline. I put on a tailored beige trench coat, grabbed my car keys, and drove to the house I grew up in. I walked through the heavy oak front door without knocking. The smell of rosemary and roasting beef hung thick in the air, a scent I used to associate with comfort. Now, it just felt like the staging area for a tribunal. I stepped into the formal living room and the breath was instantly knocked out of my lungs. Maddie and Evan were sitting on the edge of the plush sofa. They were both wearing matching custom-printed shirts. Across their small chests, bold black letters read, "Team Real Family." It was supposed to be a joke, a cheeky little visual gag for the adults to chuckle at, but looking at my niece and nephew, I saw no humor. Maddie kept pulling at the hem of her shirt, her eyes glued to the hardwood floor. Evan swung his legs nervously, looking anywhere but at me. They were props. They were living. Breathing shields dressed in cotton armor by a mother who knew exactly how to twist a knife and manipulate an audience. We moved to the dining table. The clinking of crystal glasses and heavy silverware felt deafening. Diane served the roast, her face a mask of aggressive domestic bliss. She did not wait for the plates to be passed before launching the first volley. "Violet, we all know you are disappointed about not being a bridesmaid," my mother said, pouring a glass of red wine. Her tone was patronizing, the exact voice one uses to soothe a toddler throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. "But you really should not be acting out and confusing the children. They do not understand why you are making things so difficult just because you are not sitting at the head table." I looked at my plate. I did not touch my fork. I was not going to let them reduce a coordinated legal and financial betrayal down to petty jealousy over seating arrangements. Before I could form a response, my father leaned back in his captain's chair at the head of the table. Martin Green always commanded the room with the effortless authority of a man who believed his worldview was the only objective reality. "Your sister is building a household," Martin stated, gesturing vaguely toward Brooke with his wine glass. "You do not have children, Violet. You do not understand the instinct to protect your own blood. You are looking at this from an entirely selfish perspective. Brooke is just trying to secure her family unit." "Protecting them from what?" "Dad?" I asked, my voice dangerously even. "From the aunt who has been funding their lives." That was the cue Brooke was waiting for. Her eyes instantly welled with perfectly timed tears. She pressed a linen napkin to her mouth, her shoulders shaking just enough to register as profound distress. I cannot believe you are punishing my babies just because you are mad at me, Brooke sobbed, her voice cracking with practiced vulnerability. Freezing the accounts, cutting off the money right before the wedding. How could you do that to Maddie and Evan? The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Brooke knew perfectly well that I had not touched the direct deposits that paid for the kids' private school tuition or their supplemental dental insurance. Those went straight to the institutions. The only valve I had closed was the one leaking into her own pockets. She was crying over a stolen credit card, but dressing it up as child neglect. I did not raise my voice. I did not explode or defend my love for the kids. I simply set both of my hands flat on the mahogany table and looked directly at Brooke, then shifted my gaze to my father. Since we are so concerned about the children's financial security, I said, every word crisp and distinct. Perhaps Brooke can explain the purpose of Green Hearth Events Limited Liability Company to the table. And while we are at it, I would love a public explanation of where the college fund money actually went. The dining room went completely, terrifyingly silent. For exactly half a second, the carefully constructed facade cracked. Brooke dropped the napkin, her fake tears evaporating instantly as sheer panic flashed across her face. My father's jaw tightened, his grip on his wine glass turning his knuckles stark white. The sudden drop in atmospheric pressure was palpable. I had brought a gun to a knife fight, and they both knew it. The silence was shattered by Martin. He slammed his hand flat against the table, the silverware violently rattling against the china. "We are not discussing business matters at the dinner table," his voice boomed. Thick with aggressive deflection, he was scrambling to regain control of the narrative. "This is a family dinner. This is about sisterhood. This is about keeping your petty grievances in check and saving face before the wedding." He was talking loudly, trying to physically drown out the words I had just spoken. Diane hurriedly asked who wanted more potatoes, her voice high-pitched and frantic. The tribunal had collapsed the second the accused demanded transparency. I stood up. I did not excuse myself. I picked up my trench coat from the back of the chair. "Enjoy the roast," I said, turning my back on the stunned room. I walked out the front door, the cool evening air hitting my face like a much-needed splash of ice water. As I walked down the brick pathway toward my car, I heard the heavy oak door creak open behind me. Soft, hurried footsteps padded across the porch. I turned around. Maddie was standing there, her arms wrapped tightly around her stomach, shivering slightly in the evening breeze. The custom shirt looked massive on her fragile frame. She looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. She did not look like a prop anymore. She looked like a terrified little girl carrying the weight of adults' lies. "Aunt Vi," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the wind rustling through the manicured oak trees. "Mom said if we do not say that stuff, the wedding gets ruined, and it will be all your fault." My heart broke entirely right there on the pavement. I did not step forward to hug her, knowing Brooke was likely watching from the living room window. I just gave her a slow, reassuring nod. This was no longer just about my stolen money or my grandmother's estate. It was about dismantling the machinery that was crushing this child. The modern instinct, when faced with a catastrophic public betrayal, is to immediately retaliate in kind. The overwhelming urge is to take screenshots of every receipt, every fraudulent document, and every hypocritical text message, and broadcast them across every social media platform available. I could have easily blown up Brooke's carefully curated, pastel-toned narrative with a single, devastating post. But internet outrage is cheap, fleeting, and entirely chaotic. Legal ruin, on the other hand, is permanent and precise. At 9 o'clock the following morning, I did not open an application on my phone. Instead, I drove downtown to the imposing glass and steel offices of Ward and Larkin Council Group. I sat in a corner conference room overlooking the sprawling city skyline, sliding the printed copies of my digital discoveries across a massive mahogany table. Sitting opposite me was Celeste Ward, a senior estate attorney who possessed the cold, calculating demeanor of a predatory shark wrapped in a flawlessly tailored navy suit. I explained the timeline, the sudden social ostracization, the strange LLC, and the terrifying sponsor addendum I had unearthed in my email archives. Celeste did not offer pity. She offered action. She immediately logged into the restricted county probate database, cross-referencing our late grandmother's estate files with the newly incorporated business entity. The ambient hum of the air conditioning felt deafening as her eyes scanned the glowing monitor. When she finally turned the screen toward me, the absolute worst-case scenario had materialized in black and white. Brooke had recently filed a temporary power of attorney regarding our grandmother's estate. Specifically, the filing requested the immediate unilateral transfer of all decision-making rights concerning the sprawling, highly lucrative lakefront property. The paperwork was slated to be finalized and executed right around the time of the wedding reception. "Look at the bottom of the second page," Celeste instructed, her voice devoid of any comforting inflection. I leaned closer to the monitor. There, resting quietly on the authorized consent line, was my signature, the distinct, sweeping loop of my first initial, followed by the sharp, hurried angles of my last name. It looked identical to my handwriting, but as I stared at the pixels, a sickening wave of realization washed over me. The ink did not vary in pressure. It was entirely static. It was a digital stamp. My memory violently snapped back to a chaotic Tuesday afternoon 2 years ago. I had been sitting in an airport departure lounge, waiting for an international flight. When Brooke frantically called me, she needed to enroll Evan in a specialized summer program, but because my permanent address was legally listed on some of their shared family district files, she needed my written authorization. I had quickly scanned a signed permission slip, saved it as an image file, and emailed it to her so she could process the application. My own sister had archived that email, lifted the image of my signature from a document meant to help my nephew, and pasted it onto a legal petition designed to steal my inheritance. The physical pain of that revelation was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It bypassed anger and settled directly into a freezing, hollow grief. The matching shirts on the kids, the cruel speech at the bridal boutique, the bizarre rhetoric about protecting the household. None of it was a bridal tantrum. It was a meticulously crafted legal strategy. Brooke was constructing a highly visible, public narrative that I was a hostile, toxic, estranged outsider. If the entire community believed I was entirely disconnected from the family, no one would ever question why I was quietly, cleanly severed from the generational wealth transfer. She was using the emotional theater of a wedding to execute a financial coup. "We can file a fraud claim immediately," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We can call the police." "No," Celeste replied sharply, closing the laptop. "If you confront her directly right now, or if you bring in law enforcement prematurely, she will panic. She will withdraw the filing, claim it was a terrible administrative error by a paralegal, and she will find another, deeper way to bury you. You need to maintain absolute radio silence. Do not engage. Do not argue. Let her believe her trap is perfectly set. That gives me the next 48 hours to quietly secure an ex parte injunction from a judge to freeze the entire estate and maintain the status quo before any transfer of deeds can occur." I nodded slowly, absorbing the gravity of the tactical retreat. I left the towering law firm and drove straight to a nondescript, brutalist office park on the industrial edge of the county. I had a second appointment. Nolan Price was an independent forensic accountant who viewed bank ledgers the way most people viewed religious texts. Because my name and personal email had been fraudulently attached to the early vendor contracts and the initial internal wire verification requests, Nolan possessed the necessary legal standing to begin unspooling the financial thread of Greenhearth Events Limited Liability Company. I sat in his cramped, paper-filled office for 3 hours, while he ran specialized extraction software through the available banking routing numbers. When he finally printed a single sheet of paper and slid it across his desk, the depth of the depravity was fully quantified. The $35,000 explicitly gathered from our elderly aunts, uncles, and family friends under the guise of an educational college fund for Maddie and Evan was nothing but an unregulated slush fund. Nolan traced the outbound wire transfers from the LLC. $7,000 had been wired directly to the bridal boutique for custom alterations. $8,000 went to a luxury event designer for imported floral installations. There was a massive deposit for a fleet of vintage getaway cars. But the most sickening line item rested near the bottom of the page. It was a substantial, recurring payment to a boutique digital marketing and content management agency. My sister was literally taking the money stolen from her own children's future and using it to pay a public relations firm to carefully curate, edit, and promote the toxic sister smear campaign on social media. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time after leaving Nolan's office. I gripped the leather steering wheel until my knuckles ached. The visceral urge to drive directly to the wedding venue, kick down the doors, and scream the truth at the top of my lungs was nearly paralyzing. But impulsive rage is a sloppy, ineffective weapon. Brooke wanted a spectacle. She wanted me to look unhinged, emotional, and crazy, so she could point at me and validate every lie she had told. I decided right then that I would not destroy the wedding with a loud, messy confrontation. I would attend it in absolute silence. I would let my sister put on her expensive white dress, paid for by her children's stolen future. I would let her walk down the aisle. I would let her step onto the stage, bask in the applause, and trigger her own trap. She had spent months building a flawless, towering glass house. I was simply going to wait for the exact right moment to hand her the stone. Up until Wednesday morning, I had categorized Grant Holloway as a silent, willing accomplice. He was a mid-level architectural consultant with a comfortable salary, but he certainly did not possess the kind of generational wealth required to underwrite a lavish, six-figure wedding. Yet, he had floated through the last 4 months with an infuriatingly placid demeanor, blindly approving every extravagant floral upgrade and luxury catering add-on Brooke suggested. I had naturally assumed his silence was complicity. I was completely wrong. The correction came directly from my attorney. Celeste, while executing a routine, legally mandated verification request to the luxury conservatory hosting the reception, she experienced a highly illuminating phone call. The venue manager, noticeably frustrated by a late, aggressive addendum regarding the catering minimums, complained bitterly about the groom constantly changing the financial terms. Except, when Celeste pressed for a specific name to update the legal file, the manager did not say Grant Holloway, the man aggressively micromanaging the venue contracts, rewriting the liability clauses, and shielding the financial origins of the deposit wires was Martin Green. My father had systematically and quietly boxed Grant out of all the logistical paperwork. The final piece of Grant's puzzle clicked into place at exactly 10 o'clock on Thursday morning. My phone vibrated against my desk with an encrypted text message from an unsaved number. It was Grant. The message contained a single, chilling sentence. "I think I'm being lied to about you. Can we meet?" We met at a sterile, glass-walled coffee shop in the lobby of an accounting firm 3 blocks from my corporate office. Grant looked absolutely exhausted. The polished, effortless charm he usually wore was completely gone, replaced by the deep, bruised bags of a man who had not slept in several days. He slid into the booth opposite me, clutching a paper cup of black coffee like a physical lifeline. He did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. He unlocked his smartphone and pushed it across the table. "Brooke sent me these," Grant said, his voice tight and fractured. "She said you were having a complete psychological breakdown over not being in the bridal party. She told me you were demanding total financial control over Maddie and Evan, and that you threatened to liquidate their college funds and cancel their health insurance if she did not comply with your demands." I slowly scrolled through the screenshots on his device. Brooke had meticulously deleted her own aggressive messages, leaving only heavily cropped fragments of my texts completely out of context. She had painted a flawless masterpiece of manipulation, framing me as an unstable, jealous sister obsessed with financially terrorizing her children. I did not raise my voice or get angry. I simply reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a thick manila folder. I slid it across the table until it rested against his coffee cup. "Open it," I instructed quietly. Grant hesitated for a fraction of a second, then flipped the heavy cardstock cover back. Inside were the certified, unaltered bank statements Nolan Price had extracted. Underneath those were the digital receipts for the direct tuition payments I had submitted to the kids' private academy just 48 hours ago. Attached to the back were the policies for their supplemental dental and health insurance, fully paid and completely untouched. I watched Grant's eyes dart across the columns of numbers, tracing the undeniable, physical proof that the children's actual safety nets were perfectly intact. "She told me you canceled their tuition," Grant whispered, the color rapidly draining from his face as the reality set in. "She was crying on the kitchen floor on Tuesday night, saying she had to pull from her personal emergency savings just to keep them enrolled in school." I let that profound lie hang in the sterile air of the coffee shop. I watched the reality of the woman he was about to marry violently crash down around him. He had only been fed half the truth, a version carefully curated to ensure he viewed me as a dangerous villain and Brooke as a desperate, protective mother. Grant pushed the folder back toward me, his hands shaking slightly against the table. "There is something else," he admitted, his voice dropping to a low, panicked murmur. "For the last 3 weeks, Brooke and your father have been aggressively pushing me to sign what they call family asset alignment documents. They said it was just standard wealth management protocol for high-net-worth families before merging households, but the language felt completely wrong. It was overly defensive. I told them I wanted my own independent lawyer to review it after the honeymoon, and your father practically lost his mind. He accused me of insulting the family trust." Grant looked terrified. He was trapped in the immense gravitational pull of a wedding that was only 2 days away, facing the catastrophic social annihilation of canceling it, but fully aware he was stepping blindly into a financial bear trap. "I cannot publicly side with you right now. Violet," he pleaded, his voice cracking with genuine distress. "If I walk out and blow this up today, it will destroy the kids. They have been through enough chaos with the wedding preparations. I need to get through this ceremony without blowing up their immediate lives." I completely understood. I did not need Grant to be a public martyr. I just needed him to be an aware witness. "I do not need you to stop the wedding," I told him calmly, holding his gaze. "But I need you to promise me you will not sign a single piece of paper they put in front of you, and I need to see exactly what they are planning." Grant nodded frantically. He pulled his phone back, opened his secure email application, and forwarded a file directly to my inbox. "Brooke sent me a scan of the final reception schedule last night. Look at the bottom." I opened the attachment on my own device. It was a detailed, minute-by-minute itinerary of the reception dinner, past the first dance, past the cake cutting. There was a heavily highlighted segment labeled Special Family Unity Signing. Attached to the itinerary was a low-resolution scan of the document Brooke intended to use for this highly public spectacle. My blood ran completely cold as I read the dense, legal phrasing cleverly disguised under a flowery, decorative header. It was not a ceremonial keepsake. It was not a symbolic, heartfelt gesture of sisterhood. It was a legally binding waiver of my rights to the grandmother's estate fund. Brooke was planning a lethal, inescapable public trap. She was going to hijack the emotional peak of the reception. She was going to stand up during the toasts, deliver a tearful speech about forgiveness and family bonds, and call me up onto the stage in front of 200 guests. She was going to hand me a fancy pen and frame the document as a beautiful, healing moment for the whole room to applaud. If I signed it, I legally forfeited my entire inheritance. If I refused, I would instantly become the bitter monster who ruined the wedding, perfectly validating every single lie she had told the community. Revenge is often mistaken for a loud, chaotic explosion, but true accountability requires the cold, methodical precision of a surgeon. By Friday morning, Celeste, Nolan, and I had finalized a 3-tiered blueprint. We were not going to engage in a messy shouting match. Our counterattack was built around a single, non-negotiable principle: insulating Maddie and Evan from the blast radius of their mother's impending collapse. Layer 1 was the legal barricade. Celeste drafted an emergency ex parte injunction to temporarily seal our late grandmother's entire estate. The legal filing cited credible suspicion of coercion and fraudulent documentation regarding the power of attorney Brooke intended to use. Simultaneously, we submitted a formal, legally binding notice of potential signature forgery to the corporate bank overseeing the internal wire requests. With a few keystrokes, we completely severed the financial pipeline. Brooke and my father could not move a single dime of the legacy funds without triggering an immediate federal fraud investigation. The trap they had set for me was now legally frozen in place. Layer 2 was financial containment. I refused to let Brooke use the narrative that I had financially abandoned my niece and nephew. I drove to an independent wealth management firm on the opposite side of the city. I sat down with a fiduciary who had absolutely no professional ties to Martin Green or his sprawling real estate network. I established 2 robust, legally bulletproof educational trusts, one for Maddie and one for Evan. I seeded the accounts with my own personal capital and appointed an independent third-party executor. The mandate was ironclad. The money could only be dispersed directly to accredited educational institutions upon their 18th birthdays. If Brooke attempted to weaponize her tears at the reception, claiming I had callously destroyed her children's futures, I now possessed the certified, date-stamped documents proving I was the only person actively securing them. Layer 3 was the public exposure, designed to trap Brooke in her own spotlight. But before we could finalize the logistics of the reception, my phone chimed with a secure audio message. It was from Maddie. When I pressed play, I could hear the faint, echoing sound of a running faucet in the background. She was hiding in a bathroom. Her 12-year-old voice was shaking, thick with unshed tears. "Aunt Vi, I am so sorry," Maddie whispered rapidly into the microphone. "Mom made me and Evan record these videos on her phone yesterday. She told us to look really scared and say that you yell at us all the time. She said if you show up to the wedding and try to make a scene, she is putting them on the internet to show everyone how toxic you are. Please do not be mad at me. I did not want to say those things." My chest tightened. A cold, suffocating fury settling deep into my ribs. Brooke was not just using the children as a social shield. She was actively grooming them to be the lead actors in a fabricated digital smear campaign. She was teaching them that love was conditional and that truth was malleable as long as it protected the family brand. I did not ask my niece to sneak me the videos. I did not ask her to act as my star witness or secretly record her mother's conversations. She was a child, and she was already drowning in her mother's toxic machinery. I typed back a simple, anchoring reply. "You have absolutely nothing to apologize for. You do not ever need to pick a side. You just need to tell the truth when the adults ask." Knowing how far Brooke was willing to go, I could not risk a physical altercation erupting in front of the kids when the financial truth was finally revealed. I immediately contacted the management office at Stonewall Conservatory. Utilizing my status as the original verified vendor guarantor on their master financial file, I invoked a safety clause. Citing recent volatile conflict within the bridal party, I formally requested and paid for a licensed plainclothes security officer to remain on site throughout the reception. I wired the fee of $1,500 directly to the venue. The security detail would be dressed in a plain, dark suit, blending in as standard venue management. Their sole directive was to observe, de-escalate, and physically separate any aggressive adults before the children could be traumatized by a brawl. It was completely legal, discreet, and non-negotiable. That evening, the night before the wedding, I sat alone at my kitchen island. I pulled a heavy cream-colored envelope from my stationery drawer. From the outside, it looked exactly like a standard, elegant wedding card. Inside, there was no check, no cash, and no hollow congratulations for the bride and groom. Instead, I folded a handwritten letter addressed strictly to Maddie and Evan. It was not a manifesto of revenge or a detailed list of their mother's financial crimes. It was a promise, a written guarantee that they were profoundly loved, that they were entirely separate from the vicious battlefield of the adults, and that my door would always be unconditionally open to them. No matter what lies they were forced to recite in public, I wanted them to have a physical artifact of my love, untouched by their mother's poison. I sealed the flap with a firm press of my thumb and placed it in my purse. I walked into my dimly lit bathroom and stood before the large vanity mirror. The woman looking back at me was fundamentally altered. For 37 years, I had functioned as the reliable family underwriter, the quiet fixer, the dutiful daughter who constantly bought fleeting peace with a platinum credit card, but the bone-deep exhaustion of always trying to earn my place was completely gone. The desperate, pathetic need for their validation, for a coveted seat at their dinner table, had evaporated into thin air. I was no longer a discarded, heartbroken bridesmaid mourning a severed relationship. I was a tactician stepping onto a battlefield, fully armed and entirely unbothered by whether or not I was recognized as real family. Tomorrow, I was going to watch Brooke lock the doors to her own glass house, and I was going to let her throw the first stone. Stonewall Conservatory sat on the manicured edge of Ashfield Ridge, a sprawling architectural marvel of vaulted glass and wrought iron. The late afternoon sun filtered through the massive transparent ceiling, casting a warm golden glow over the reception hall, the floral arrangements alone towering cascades of imported white orchids and trailing eucalyptus draped over every available surface spoke of a budget that had long ago shattered the financial limits Brooke had tearfully claimed to possess. Every pristine petal, every velvet-draped chair, and every crystal goblet was a physical monument to the money she had systematically siphoned from my accounts and the future she was actively stealing from her own children. The beauty of the room was suffocating because I knew exactly how deep the rot beneath it went. I arrived wearing a simple, tailored charcoal silk dress. I wore no extravagant jewelry and kept my makeup entirely muted. I did not want to look like a woman prepared for a fight. I wanted to look like an observer. I bypassed the crowded coat check and walked directly toward the ornate gilded mirror displaying the seating assignments. I scanned the elegant calligraphy, Table 1, Table 2, scanning all the way down to Table 20. My name was entirely absent from the glass. Murmurs began to ripple through the velvet-lined foyer almost immediately. Extended cousins and family friends who had diligently read Brooke's vague, victimizing social media posts nudged each other, their eyes darting toward me. I did not shrink away or look at the floor. I took a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and stood calmly near a towering marble pillar, letting them stare. Diane swept past me in a flurry of champagne taffeta, her eyes aggressively snapping forward, actively pretending I was entirely invisible. Martin, however, paused. He adjusted the lapels of his custom tuxedo and offered me a wide, sickeningly paternal smile. It was the smile of a predator who firmly believed the trap was already sprung and the prey was securely caged. He stepped close and clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder, his grip tight enough to bruise the skin through my silk dress. "I am glad you decided to act like an adult and show up." "Violet," he murmured smoothly, his voice dropping so the passing guests could not hear. "Just play along tonight. Do not make a scene. It is all about preserving the family honor." He patted my shoulder once more and walked away, fully convinced that by 9 o'clock, I would be publicly strong-armed into signing away my inheritance to avoid a scandal. The string quartet began playing, signaling the start of the ceremony. The heavy mahogany doors to the botanical garden opened. I did not attempt to find a rogue empty chair. I stood in the very back row, blending into the shadows of a massive weeping fig tree. Maddie and Evan appeared first. They were dressed immaculately, but their body language was entirely wrong for a celebration. Evan was picking nervously at the seam of his ring-bearer pillow, and Maddie's smile was rigid, her eyes wide and terrified, just before they began their walk down the aisle. I watched Brooke lean down and violently yank the collar of Evan's jacket straight, hissing something into his ear that made the 9-year-old boy visibly flinch. This was not a wedding. It was a hostage situation disguised as a photo shoot. Grant stood at the altar. When he finally turned to face the crowd, his eyes scanned the sea of faces until they locked onto mine standing in the far back. The deep exhaustion from our coffee shop meeting was still etched into his features, but his jaw was firmly set. He gave me a barely perceptible, singular nod. The silent treaty held. He was entirely awake, and he was not going to sign a single piece of paper they put in front of him tonight. Brooke made her grand entrance, a vision in imported French lace. The ceremony itself was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. When it came time for the vows, Brooke did not focus her words on her future with Grant. Instead, she continuously looped her rhetoric back to the concept of unwavering loyalty. She spoke breathlessly into the microphone about the unbreakable bonds of blood, the heavy importance of legacy, and how this day was a triumph for the real family who had stood by her through unimaginable recent betrayals. Every word was a meticulously planted seed, preparing the audience for the grand, forgiving spectacle she had orchestrated for the reception dinner. After the applause faded and the guests migrated to the open stone terrace for cocktail hour, I found a quiet corner near the balustrade. My father's older sister, my Aunt Helen, stumbled over to me. She was already 3 glasses deep into the signature gin cocktails. Her cheeks flushed red. "Violet," Helen slurred, leaning heavily against the cold stone railing. "I simply cannot believe they did not give you a proper seat. But listen, I did what I could. When I checked in at the front desk, the coordinator handed me a second donation envelope. She said Brooke was hoping for a final, unexpected push for the kids' college fund to celebrate the new marriage. I put another $500 in. It is all for the kids, right? Everything for the kids." My stomach churned violently. The $35,000 they had already embezzled was apparently not enough. Brooke was literally shaking down her own wedding guests at the door, squeezing every last drop of cash into her fraudulent corporate account before the night was over. She was bleeding the room dry under the impenetrable guise of maternal love. I gently excused myself from Helen and walked back inside the main reception hall. The venue staff was busy lighting hundreds of taper candles on the long banquet tables. Near the head table, an ornate, gold-framed easel displayed the evening's beautifully printed itinerary. I stepped closer, letting my eyes bypass the first dance, the cake cutting, and the father-daughter dance. I stared directly at the bottom line, printed in bold, undeniable lettering, "Special Family Unity Signing," scheduled immediately after the final toast. The legal guillotine was perfectly polished and waiting on the stage. I took a deep, steadying breath of the lavender-scented air. The hour of the absolute climax was rapidly approaching, but I kept my hands folded quietly in front of me. It was not quite time to strike. The clinking of heavy silver against fine bone china echoed through the vaulted glass walls of the conservatory. I remained standing near the perimeter of the dining area, a silent ghost haunting the edges of a lavish celebration funded entirely by my stolen credit. The overhead crystal chandeliers began to dim, a subtle atmospheric shift signaling the transition between the extravagant main courses and the evening's scheduled speeches. Suddenly, sharp fingers dug viciously into my left forearm. I turned my head to see the bride. Brooke's face was angled toward a nearby table of laughing relatives. A radiant, joyous smile plastered flawlessly across her professionally painted lips. But the physical grip on my arm was violent, her acrylic nails pressing hard enough through the charcoal silk of my dress to leave deep, aching indentations in my skin. "Walk with me right now," Brooke whispered through gritted teeth, her perfect, photogenic smile never wavering for the oblivious audience surrounding us. She steered me aggressively past the towering dessert staging area, pushing through a set of heavy oak doors and into a dimly lit, narrow antechamber used primarily by the catering staff. The thick doors swung shut heavily behind us, instantly muffling the joyous roar of the 200 guests outside. The absolute second we were isolated from the crowd, the radiant, blushing bride vanished entirely. Her face hardened into a severe mask of pure, venomous calculation. "Let us get this over with quickly," Brooke snapped, dropping her hand from my arm as if touching me for a second longer was physically repulsive. "Sign it, and I will let you stop playing the pathetic victim for the rest of the night." She pulled a sleek, dark leather portfolio from a nearby decorative mahogany table. She flipped the heavy cover open for just a fraction of a second, deliberately showing me the thick, textured legal paper secured tightly inside. "It is a spiritual gift for Mom," Brooke recited, her tone dripping with a highly synthetic, practiced sweetness. "A symbolic gesture of family unity to show her and everyone else that we are mature enough to put the past behind us." I did not need to step closer to read the fine print printed at the bottom of the page. I already knew every single devastating word typed on that document. It was the absolute, irrevocable surrender of my co-management rights to our grandmother's lucrative estate, cleverly disguised beneath a flowery, decorative header meant to look like a sentimental keepsake. Before I could form a verbal response, the brass handle of the heavy oak door clicked loudly. My father stepped into the narrow, shadowed hallway. The ambient light caught the sharp, expensive lines of his custom tuxedo. He positioned his broad frame strategically, effectively blocking the only exit, using his sheer physical presence to aggressively amplify the psychological claustrophobia of the small room. "Do not ruin your sister's special day again, Violet," Martin commanded, his voice a low, authoritative rumble explicitly designed to brook absolutely no argument. "You have caused more than enough stress and embarrassment for 1 week. Just sign the document. We will consider this entire unfortunate chapter permanently closed, and you can go back to your quiet life." Right on cue, as if executing a thoroughly rehearsed stage play, Diane slipped into the room behind him. She had brought the children with her. Her hands clamped tightly onto Maddie and Evan's shoulders as she physically pushed them forward like disposable human shields. The kids looked completely exhausted. Their expensive formal clothes were slightly rumpled, and their wide, anxious eyes darted frantically between the tense faces of the adults. "Look at them! Violet!" my mother pleaded, instantly weaponizing her soft maternal tone to inflict maximum guilt. "The children just want a normal, happy family. Stop being so incredibly stubborn and give them some peace tonight." It was a flawlessly executed psychological ambush. They had cornered me in a confined, windowless space, applied my father's heavy patriarchal authority, deployed severe emotional blackmail via the terrified children, and presented a fabricated, seemingly easy escape route. In the past, the crushing, all-consuming force of this coordinated family assault would have shattered my resolve. I would have reached for the pen without thinking and signed away my own future just to make the suffocating, relentless pressure stop. But tonight, I felt completely emptied out, untouched by their carefully staged guilt trips. I glanced at the dark leather folder clenched in Brooke's hands, then lifted my eyes to meet my sister's with absolute, icy calm. "I have just one question for you," I said, my voice flat and stripped of the frantic panic they had all been waiting for. I made sure to speak loudly and clearly enough for both of my parents to catch every word. "Which bank account is the children's college fund in right now?" The pointed specificity of the question struck the room like a sudden jolt. Brooke immediately lost the smooth, rehearsed rhythm she had been relying on. For exactly half a second, her jaw went entirely slack. Her eyes widened in genuine, unfiltered terror. She had absolutely not anticipated me bringing up the stolen money, especially not the specific phrasing of the educational college fund, in front of our father. Martin firmly believed the shadow company they created was solely a real estate holding shell for the inheritance. He had no idea she had been independently shaking down the wedding guests and stealing from her own children. The brief, agonizing flash of panic on Brooke's face instantly mutated into volatile, defensive rage. She slammed the leather folder shut with a loud, aggressive crack. "You are completely insane," Brooke hissed, her voice trembling slightly as she desperately tried to regain control of the rapidly collapsing narrative. "You are obsessed with money and control. This is exactly why you are destroying this family." Martin stepped forward, his heavy brow furrowed in sudden, deep confusion. The unified front was fracturing. What exactly is she talking about? Brooke, what college fund? The 529 plans. Nothing, Dad. She is just trying to deflect because she is incredibly jealous. Brooke snapped frantically, her breathing becoming shallow and noticeably erratic. She was rapidly losing her iron grip, the perfectly curated, pastel-toned script unraveling violently in real time right in front of her co-conspirators. At that exact, critical moment, the slim leather clutch resting in my hands vibrated with a distinct, sustained buzz. I kept my eyes completely locked on Brooke as I unclasped the bag and pulled out my phone. A secure, encrypted message glowed brightly against the dark screen. It was from Nolan Price, my forensic accountant. Bank response officially confirmed. The massive outbound wire transfer from the Green Hearth Limited Liability Company was just successfully halted. The entire account is fully frozen due to the active suspected signature fraud alert. They are completely locked out of the funds. I read the words twice to ensure complete. Undeniable comprehension. The financial guillotine had quietly fallen while we stood in the dark. The unregulated slush fund was dead. The stolen inheritance money was trapped. Brooke had absolutely nothing left to her name but the useless piece of paper in her trembling hands and the desperate lie caught in her throat. I slid the phone back into my clutch, offering my frantic sister a cold, entirely empty smile that offered zero forgiveness. The heavy, suffocating silence in the antechamber was suddenly shattered by the booming, amplified voice of the master of ceremonies echoing through the walls from the main dining hall. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could please have your attention directed to the main stage, the beautiful bride and groom would like to invite you all to witness a very special, heartfelt moment. It is time for the family unity signing. Brooke's posture instantly snapped back to rigid. Theatrical perfection. The public summons was her ultimate lifeline, violently pulling her back to the perceived safety of her carefully constructed stage. She grabbed the leather portfolio tightly against her chest, her knuckles turning stark white with tension. She turned back to look at me, the brief, panicked fear in her eyes entirely replaced by a venomous, triumphant certainty. She fully believed that under the blinding spotlight, surrounded by 200 expectant, wealthy faces, my deeply ingrained corporate obedience and crippling fear of public shame would force me to silently comply with her demands. "I will see you up on the stage, sister," Brooke whispered maliciously, pulling the heavy door open and stepping back out into the blinding light of the reception. The master of ceremonies handed the microphone to Brooke. She stood at the center of the stage, bathed in the soft, warm glow of the spotlight, looking every inch the flawless, triumphant bride. She took a deep, dramatic breath, letting a single, perfectly timed tear glisten in her eye before addressing the 200 guests. "Tonight is about new beginnings," Brooke began, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. "But it is also about healing. My sister and I have had our struggles recently. We have faced misunderstandings that tested our bond, but blood is thicker than pride. Tonight, I want to invite Violet up here to sign a special family keepsake, a symbol that we are moving forward, together, as a real family." The banquet hall erupted into warm, approving applause. The extended relatives who had been whispering about me all evening were now wiping away tears, completely captivated by the beautiful narrative of forgiveness. I walked smoothly up the steps to the stage. I did not look like a defeated woman. My charcoal silk dress caught the light as I stopped right in front of my sister. Brooke held out the dark leather portfolio and a heavy gold pen, her eyes blazing with a silent, victorious command. I did not take the pen. Instead, I reached out and gently took the microphone from her other hand. The room fell into an expectant, hushed silence. "I will gladly sign it," I said, my voice projecting crystal clear across the sprawling conservatory. "But I will only sign it if you read every single page out loud in front of everyone right now, because real family does not need to hide the fine print." Brooke's flawless smile instantly shattered. She yanked the leather folder backward, her face flushing a deep, angry crimson. She shook her head, leaning into the microphone I was holding. "Stop it, Violet. You are ruining the moment." Before I could reply, my father marched onto the stage. Martin snatched the microphone from my hand, his face purple with absolute rage. "Enough of this nonsense. Sign the paper, Violet, and stop embarrassing your sister in front of our guests. She is not signing a surrender of her grandmother's estate. Martin." A sharp, authoritative female voice rang out from the front table. Celeste Ward stood up, smoothing the front of her designer blazer. She had been sitting quietly as a registered guest of the venue management all evening. She stepped toward the stage, her voice easily cutting through the rising murmurs of the confused crowd. "That is not a sentimental keepsake. It is a legally binding transfer of assets designed to strip Violet of her inheritance, and as of 5 o'clock this evening, a county judge has entirely frozen that estate due to suspected fraudulent activity." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Brooke took a step back, looking frantically at our father. But before Martin could formulate a defense, another figure stood up from the back of the room. Nolan Price, my forensic accountant, walked forward holding a thick stack of printed ledgers. "And while we are discussing fraudulent activity," Nolan announced, projecting his voice like a seasoned litigator, "the guests in this room should know about the family legacy table sponsorship. The $35,000 you generously donated for the Children's College Fund was never placed in an educational trust. It was funneled directly into a private corporate account managed by Brooke and Martin Green. It paid for the imported orchids on your tables, the custom alterations on the wedding dress, and a digital marketing agency hired to run a smear campaign." The silence that followed was entirely deafening. The beautiful pastel-toned illusion of the wedding evaporated in a matter of seconds, leaving only the ugly, rotting truth exposed under the crystal chandeliers. Grant Holloway stepped forward from his spot near the edge of the stage. He reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. He unfolded it and held it up for the room to see. "Brooke handed me a copy of this exact same asset alignment document yesterday," Grant said, his voice raw and entirely exhausted. "She told me I had to sign it immediately after the reception, but she explicitly instructed me to never let Violet read it. She told me Violet was insanely jealous and trying to control the children's money. None of that was true." Brooke spun around, her face contorted in pure panic. The glass house was violently shattering around her. She lunged for the microphone, her voice high-pitched and hysterical. "She is lying. Violet is manipulating all of you. She threatened my babies. She told me she would ruin their lives if I did not give her control. No, she did not." The small, fragile voice did not come from me. It came from the front row. Maddie was standing there, her hands balled into tight fists, tears streaming freely down her young face. The entire room turned to look at the 12-year-old girl. "Mom told us to say Aunt Vi was not real family so she would stop asking questions," Maddie sobbed, her voice echoing painfully in the massive hall. "Aunt Vi never threatened us. Mom made us lie." The absolute heartbreak of that moment transcended any financial revenge. I immediately caught the eye of the plainclothes security coordinator standing near the exit. I gave him a sharp nod. He quickly moved forward alongside the venue's dedicated childcare worker. They gently took Maddie and Evan by the hands and escorted them out of the main hall, guiding them toward the quiet, soundproofed bridal suite before the imminent explosion occurred. They did not need to witness the adults tearing each other apart. With the children safely removed, the complete collapse began. Brooke lost whatever remained of her sanity, screaming a string of vicious, unfiltered insults at me. Diane rushed the stage, but instead of comforting her daughter, she turned violently on my father, right there, in front of 200 guests. My parents began a vicious shouting match, furiously blaming each other for the creation of the shadow company and accidentally confessing their exact roles in the embezzlement scheme. Grant did not wait for the argument to end. He calmly walked to the center microphone. "I am canceling the marriage registration tonight. I am not signing another piece of paper with this family." He dropped the microphone onto the stage, turned around, and walked directly out of the conservatory. Chaos erupted. Aunts and uncles abandoned their tables, swarming the stage and loudly demanding their donation money back. The beautiful reception devolved into a frantic, angry mob demanding accountability. I didn't gloat, and I didn't throw a single insult at my sister as she wept on the stage. I just picked up the discarded microphone one last time. "For the record," I said, my voice slicing cleanly through the yelling, "I established 2 fully funded, legally protected educational trusts for Maddie and Evan yesterday afternoon. They are overseen by an independent third party. The children's futures are entirely secure, and their money can no longer be exploited by the adults in this room." I set the microphone down. I turned my back on the screaming relatives, the weeping bride, and the shattered remnants of the grand illusion. I walked out the heavy mahogany doors, down the grand stone staircase, and out into the cool night air. When I finally reached my car, the horizon was just beginning to turn a pale, bruised purple with the approaching dawn. I drove away from Ashfield Ridge in complete silence. The heavy, exhausting burden of constantly trying to prove my worth to them was entirely gone. I no longer needed to argue about whether or not I was considered real family, because on that chaotic, destructive night, I was the only person who had actually acted like one. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from so we can connect. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Lily Revenge Stories, like the video, and share it so more people can hear it.